So something I want to address before we get too deep into this tutorial is why does it sound like I'm a phone sex operator for this one? Why am I trying to seduce you with my kind of like whispering in your ear voice? And that's a very good question, and the answer to that ties into a urgency, a issue that is going to be overhanging this entire tutorial. And that is, if you look at the bottom right corner, you're going to see that it is 11:14, soon 11:15 p.m. Now, those of you who are doing Nodevember are probably like shitting their pants right now. You're thinking, oh, I only have like 45 minutes until it's midnight, until this is no longer valid. That is correct. We have like something like 45 minutes to get through this tutorial in completion, meaning if I mess up, I am fucked. If I explain for over 45 minutes, I'm fucked. I do want to follow the rules of Nodevember, so we are committing on this take. Whatever happens, happens. So it's also day 5 of not only Nodevember, but No Nut November, which means, 5 days of not coming. I'm a bit antsy, but even though I can't cream myself, why not make some cream pie? So for this one, the topic, the thing we're making is a pastry, so I said, why not make some pie? And yeah. Oh, I don't think I explained why I'm whispering as well. And not just because, it's late, but because there are roommates here that are trying to sleep and I can't be, waking them up being like, oh, connect the vector displacement into the blah, 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 right? They'd fucking stab me, right? So yeah, that's the scenario. We now have 45 minutes to get into it. Let's make a pastry. This is the product we're going to be making. And as always, we have the finished blend before we even start. You could pick this up on Patreon. I'm very bad at pitching this. I feel like my advertisements are garbage. But again, if you want the completed blend file with all the blah, 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 it exists. But I'm going to show you how to make this from scratch, at least as close as possible as time allows. Okay, so what we are going to be making, of course, is this pie node. And you might be thinking, okay, it doesn't look that complex. But again, the whole thing is procedural. And here are some of the controls that we still have access to. First of all, whoops. Probably not that one. First of all, we have the transform. So is it a cube? Is it a slice of pie? Who's to determine, really? We also have the size of the pie, which is kind of one of my favorite sliders because it could be like, oh, I'm eating too much on this Thanksgiving versus, oh, maybe I have an eating problem and I think that this is a full portion size. Maybe joking about this stuff's a bit edgy. I don't know, maybe going a bit too far. Anyways, we have that. We can also control the crust height and also like the number of ridges, the quality of those ridges, the filling, stuff like that. Also the color, so you could have like puke green interiors and stuff like that. Point is, all that stuff exists, so let me show you how to make it. So same kind of setup as always. By the way, if this is your first Nodevember tutorial, welcome your ass over here, It's going to get pretty complicated because I'm assuming you already know the stuff that I covered in the previous 4, but you know what? Everybody's a Nodevember virgin at some point, so the first time's always going to be awkward, and you got to kind of go through it, even though it's going to be major cringe. What I'm doing right now is just setting up our scene before we do any of the vector displacement stuff, making sure displacement is set, the displacement settings is set to displacement only. I'm making sure that this has enough geometry for our displacements, keeping it simple since we want to start with a perfect cube. And lastly, we want to set up an HDRI system since the lighting that already exists in Blender, just a spot lamp, makes me wanna fucking vomit. Okay, it's not looking too hot. Let's load an HDRI from HDRI Haven, and I think at this point we should be good to go. So again, I'm sorry for the phone sex operator thing. I really can't help it. I gotta whisper into the mic. I wonder how many people are falling asleep to this tutorial. But what we've set up is an HDRI, a cube of subdivisions, and a material with vector displacement enabled, set to displacement only. Okay, so this is our setup scene. Let's save it as such. Of course, I'm going to try to pick a creative blend name that I haven't used before because I think that's pretty important. So let's do something like I have a Patreon. It only gets funnier with age. It's like a fine wine. It will get you drunk with laughter. Okay. So name of the game is turning this cube into a slice of pie that not only looks correct, but you want to just dive into it. You want to get the cherry all over, or maybe the apple, whatever kind of pie you want, a cream pie. You want to get it all over your cheeks, all over your lips. And the question is, how do we go from a kind of geometry that's very cube-like, in fact, it's the cube, how do we go from that to a slice of pie that's this triangular, rounded thing with ridges and all that? And the answer is, as always, going step by step by step. But for this tutorial, I want to do something a bit differently, and technically, I've been teaching maybe not the best practices, technically practices that work. Of course, I got the results from before, but this tutorial, there's a couple things I want to do differently since I've been speaking to Gabe and Aaron and others. So normally the way we would start off is using the XYZ vectors, the position of every point on this cube. That's the position here. And then we'd start manipulating vector displacement stuff until we reach the socket, right? And that's a fine workflow. However, the reason that's not ideal is the way Blender works is all these coordinate systems do not update with vector displacement, which is kind of a confusing idea. But what you need to understand is generated coordinates in the texture coordinates node are the only exception to this rule. This is the only coordinate system that moves along with the displacement, with the deformation. It comes along for the ride, and that isn't like entirely important. But what it is useful for is creating masks that move with the displacement. So we can have a mask for where the cherry is, etc. Point is, we're going to use generated coordinates for this one. And what we want to do is have it emulate object coordinates. So it looks like this, or geometry coordinates. And to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take our generated coordinates and first of all displace it, right? So the origin is in the middle. So I'm just going to subtract 0.5, 0.5, 0.5. So again, the origin was in the corner of this bounding box, shoving it over, saying, you know, coordinate system, just work with me here. Center yourself. Stay humble. And then the second thing we need to do, by the way, is since this was a 0 to 1 coordinate system that we just shifted, the origin is going from here to 0.5 in every direction, so we just want to scale it as well by 2. So instead of going 0.5 in every direction, it's going 1 in every direction. What does that mean for all the non-nerds out there? What it means is if we look at object coordinates or the position in the geometry node, this is going to be identical to this, right? If we didn't have this, you could see it's a bit darker, but with all these vector math nonsenses, multiple nonsenses, it's like octopi. With that whole setup, this is identical to position coordinates or object coordinates. However, this actually sticks with the deformation since it's generated coordinates. Okay, let's continue. I feel like that's pretty boring. Okay, so first step for turning this into a pie is, okay, we need it to be a triangle and rounded, and I know you're getting very antsy. How do we actually start this? What is the first thing we can do to get that kind of shape? And that is just turning this cube into a triangle. Nothing complicated here. And you might be thinking, okay, how do we turn it into a triangle? It probably involves a lot of complicated math. Do I need to take multivariable calculus and real analysis and discrete? No, you don't. All we need to do is take this cube and say, keep this edge the same. And if we were doing this in edit mode, how would we do this? We take this face and extrude it like this, right? That's a triangle if we do it all the way. We want to do the same deformation, but this time with vector displacement. So in other words, we need a gradient going from 1 up here to 0, and that's just going to be the scaling along the x-axis, right? That's the edit mode transformation we did. Okay, how do we do that? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the y-coordinate, because this is going to give us a gradient going from top to bottom. We want to take this and say, don't start at 1 and then go to 0 and -1, right? What we want to do is use a map range node, which again takes an interval, outputs another interval. It's spitting and releasing intervals. It's quite gross, really. And we want to say don't start from 0 to 1, but from -1 to 1, which will now give us the full thing since it's taking the whole gradient and mapping it to 0 to 1. And I mean, pretty much this is what we want. We have 1 up here, 0 over here, and the rest of this is just multiplication. So we are going to do multiply vector math. We're going to use the prefig, again, I'm stumbling on my words, I'm so excited to say this again. Every time we do a bunch of steps, that is what you are going to plug into the next vector math node. So I'm not going to plug in this one. The last vector math you used, you're going to plug it in, okay? We are going to multiply it by, we want to separate by components again so we can control this. We are going to do 1, 1, 1. So right now when we connect this to here, it's going to give us almost the right thing, although it does scale everything up by 2. And again, the reason this happens is this is supposed to be the displacement, not the final position of every vertex, which means what we need to do is take this and subtract away the initial coordinates that, again, we transformed. And really what we can do is we can take this and make it its own node group since we're just going to be treating it like one coordinate system. So again, what we are doing here is we're saying we have the deformation that's on top of our cube. We then need to subtract away the original coordinates so that all we have is the deformation and not the original information as well. Okay? I know it's a bit confusing, but whatever. Okay? So what we have is a multiplication by 1, 1, 1, which we can control to get different kinds of results. But of course, what we want to do is take this and say, as we go along the gradient, we want to pinch left and right on the x-axis. So we take this, put it in the x-axis, and that gives us a perfect triangle. And you're probably thinking, okay, that's perfect, and you know it is. However, what you're probably noticing is the face that was over here gets compressed into an infinitely thin line. This is like when you're in high school and you're trying to conform. You're stretching yourself too thin, spreading yourself too thin. I feel like that analogy doesn't work here. But you know what? Sometimes you just got to try to be entertaining. Throw the shit on the wall and see what smears are there, and try to read the try to read the leaves and all that. Kind of like fortune telling. Yes, this makes a triangle, but again, it compresses all this geometry here. So we do want to add a bit of buffer room because it's never good to compress all this geometry. So instead of going from 0 to 1, we go to like 0 to 1 or something to 1. And that just says when we get over here, don't multiply it by 0 on the x-axis, but only do it by like 0.05 or 0.02, whatever. So it still pretty much looks like a triangle. And in fact, a pie slice usually isn't a perfect triangle, so that's fine, but it also behaves normally as well. Another thing we can do is say, okay, this is the kind of pie slice that, this is kind of like the American health crisis, in a nutshell. So we want to take this and scale it down on the z-axis, and we can do that very easily here. And I also believe, what does scaling on the y-axis do? Just gives us length, right? We could mess with that, or we could just leave this be. So right now we have the triangle and the thickness of that triangle. So again, we're going to try to keep organized this time because I feel like I haven't been doing a great job at that. What we are going to do is just say this is the second step in the transformation. So originally we had our coordinate system, and then this is the next step. So take this, Control G, and now this is a group, and it probably makes sense to give this a name, N, and then just call it maybe triangle. So if we need to refer back to this to change like the pinching and all that, we just see the name triangle, and that is good. And in fact, we don't need to actually see our output map. So just get rid of that, and then, whoops, I'm trying to hit N so many times it's making me dizzy. And then get rid of that so that only the vector is being outputted. Okay, cool. Next step is we want to do our rounding, or maybe a bit of pinching since this triangle is pretty big. We could do that as one step actually, so that's just vector math. And you take this and multiply it again. This is the next step in the chain. 1, 1, 1, and this time we are going to compress the x-axis. And for those of you who are kind of like the know-it-all teacher pet kind, I fucking hate you guys. But for those of you that exist that are going to comment, yes, this step isn't necessary here. We could actually compress it here by doing some map range nonsense. So instead of starting at 1, we could do it here. And that's, that's technically correct. I'm just trying to keep it nice and simple. But now that I'm saying it, maybe this is the way to go. Whatever. Leave your comments. I don't give a fuck. There we go. Okay, so now we have our initial scaling. Next step, I guess, since we skipped this thing or compressed it in here, the X scaling is we want to take this and give it roundness, but not everywhere. We just want to say, take this side and round it so it's as if we took a slice out of a circular pie. Right now, this is the kind of pie that's like very Euclidean, right? We don't want it like this. Okay, so to do this, we're going to do the same trick we have employed a million times. This is standard operating procedure. We are going to take the length, and again, the reason we are doing this is a nice way to make a circular mask. So let's just do that. We are going to use math greater than, or I guess, you know what, I think I've been changing my ways recently. Instead of doing harsh cutoffs, I've been tending to use map range nodes instead, which effectively kind of give us the same setup, but just a tiny bit of a linear gradient instead of this cutoff, right? And I'll explain what I'm doing in a second, but just something to note is right now this map, wow. I really want to note that. Something to note is while this mask is behaving normally, this isn't really expected behavior from what we've been doing recently. Like we've been using geometry node and set this up with position, and you're going to see that when I do it like this, you're getting a slightly different result. And this is part of why we are using generated coordinates, because it kind of prevents issues like this. That's just a quick note. But to round this, what we are going to do is we are going to make a circular mask saying in this area, Blender, leave it alone. Stop trying to influence it and changing and fucking everything up. In the black circle, have a influence of 0. And of course, the issue here is if we make this kind of too big, we do want this corner right here, this triangular, vertex in some sense to be here, but then it also cuts off that area. So what we can do is vector addition, and this will just slide everything down nicely when we connect it here. And I'm just going to slide it down the y-axis. So we still have the same setup, but now it's centered over here instead of actually at the object center, which kind of makes it a bit messy, but also pretty, but also pretty convenient for us. I'm making that way too big. Let's try like 0.9 or something like that. And again, even though we are using generated coordinates, this is still privy to some issues that are solved with more subdivisions. We'll talk about it later, but for now, let's just continue as if everything is going fine. We want to say for the white area, what we need to do is multiply or scale those vectors by the reciprocal of, I mean, whatever length they are, because in other words, we kind of want to map it onto a sphere which has unit length everywhere. And by taking the reciprocal, we kind of do that. I've talked about this trick a bunch of times. If you don't understand it, think about it while I drink some water. Something about that phone operator voice really gets my throat wanting to just destroy itself. Okay, what we are going to do again, we are going to add in a math node, division by the reciprocal. So 1 over this gives us the inverted length, which again is the exact length we need to map this onto a sphere. Think about why that's true, but it is true. It's kind of like normalization in one dimension. We take this and then we want to scale, we want to scale, and remember, and I think this is true again, whatever the last vector math node you are using is, that outputs a vector, so not this length one, make sure that is what you're using in your thing, and we'll see if that's true. But we're going to put this in here, and for now, we can scale it by, actually, I guess we could clean this up a little bit. I think this would have worked. However, I do want to make a bit of a mask, so let's add in a mix RGB. Again, I'm saying I want this cutoff where in the middle, nothing happens, and on the white, do that reciprocal trick. So let's use this as a factor. The bottom, or the top socket, which is black, is going to be the one that isn't transformed, so scale it by 1. In other words, multiply by 1. Do nothing, stay stationary, live your life as is. And then for the bottom socket, use the reciprocal. Okay. So this should be exactly the mask that we need. Let's test it out. We're going to put it in the scale and put this in the vector displacement. Boom. And now you can see we get a circular cutout. And again, it is translating everything over because we are using this addition, but that actually is nice for working in the future, because if you don't have this, you're going to see you get some weird artifacts because all this math is dependent on this being the last vector math node. So again, what's happening here, final explanation before we move on. This is the factor. Right now we're seeing it from the eyes of displacement. That doesn't have enough geometry. But again, this is the mask saying where it's black, output 1, so scale by 1, and where it's white, put the reciprocal of the length as the scaling factor, okay? So that is pretty good. Let's move on. So we're going to take this. We are going to, we don't actually need to view it. We're going to take this. We are going to control G because this is now the next step in our group. And actually, one thing we could do is if we want to do a correction, which maybe isn't the best idea. If you did want to do it, you just put this in here, and instead of adding this vector, you kind of add the opposite, and that's going to shift it back down to where it's supposed to be, or maybe that divided by 2. For now, we're not going to do that because I think we're going to make more radial masks, but for now, that is fine. So this is going to be the rounding of our triangle. And one kind of very technical detail that maybe is worth mentioning is right now this is mapping it, again, using that inverse relationship to a sphere. So when you're looking at it kind of like from this view, you can see it kind of has a bit of curvature going this way, and that's more obvious, again, the more geometry we have with these things. It has a bit of curvature because it's mapping it to a sphere, not like a circle, like a pie is supposed to be. If you want to be very technical about it, you could fix that by, instead of scaling on x, y, and z, we multiply component-wise and say do the same thing for x and y, kind of like the exact same idea, multiply by this factor that we made, but keep z constant, okay? Which will give us the same thing, but now it's kind of nice and circular. It's kind of hard to tell the difference, but believe me, it does exist, especially when we make our circle bigger and smaller, which, by the way, you can do like this. But it does create some issues if you go past the mask. Okay. So now we have our rounding, and the question is, what should be our next step in the process? Because already it's kind of looking like a slice of pie. I'm not saying I did like a great job or anything, but it's kind of shaping up. So I think the next thing we could do is maybe make the crust. So this kind of area over here, we want to take this and elevate it. So we could borrow some notes from before, but I'm just going to set this up newly just to keep organized and not to get too confusing in this tutorial. By the way, how much time do we have left? 11:33. We have under half an hour left. Situation is dire, boys. This is like Die Hard. Well, I think they made like 5 movies. This is the 6th Die Hard. Blend Hard or Die Hard. What we're going to do is same thing from before. What I want to do is isolate the area that it is we want to raise. So again, map range node. Let's look at this from the top. And since, again, the reason I didn't do this transformation backwards, so again, the slice has been raised up, is because this time when we do the same thing that we did before, we don't have the issue, if I can pick a number that makes sense, we don't have the issue where the corner isn't included because we've already done that shifting, and we can shift everything back as the last step. But now we've isolated this gradient and have kind of a linear fall off, and we can play around with that later. We want to take this and raise it up. And of course, it's not all of this. We want to raise it only the top half, because if we do it right now, and again, I know this stuff's hard to visualize. Don't cry. At least, maybe cry in my comment section. I don't read it. But right now, the issue is if we take this and raise it on the Z component, which again is what we want to do. We want to make raised crust. What we're going to get is this, which, I mean, first of all, it's looking messed up, because if you're eating a pie with this crust, I think you're probably being poisoned. I think that's a fair assumption to make. Not only is it going up too much, which is fine, we can fix that, but it's also taking the bottom with it, which is not something that we actually want, okay? So to solve this, we also need to add in a separate mask that we are going to multiply in. Let's separate x, y, z. And it turns out that the z component, once we actually connect our vector displacement, turns out the z component exactly isolates for, bottom versus top. So what we could do is we could take this and then math. Whoop, not vector math. Everything's going wrong. You want to add in math because, again, this is a float, one-dimensional, and you are going to multiply these together so that now we have a combination of these masks. So what is above z equals 0 along with, and let's clamp that, along with our map range, like radial thing from before. Okay, so now let's try to add this and see what happens this time. So this time, let's connect it to our vector displacement. We should have something that looks a bit better. Of course, the kind of slope or the fall off isn't perfect, but we'll talk about that in a second. But now you can see that this section was added correctly. And by the way, another technical thing for the people who care, when you look at the wireframe modifier, basically the distribution of our geometry, to make it less intense, you're going to see that we're not going to get too much geometry over here because we're doing an addition. The map range helps it a bit. Ideally, you do a multiplication instead of an addition, but you know what? You can't win them all. So that's just something if you want to conserve geometry everywhere. So now to talk about the slope. The slope is basically saying what is the height of this crust thing. It's a result of that. In other words, if we take this map range and start messing with it, it should solve it. I'm not sure which slider it is, but it's definitely one of these. There we go. It's this one, but we need it to be very small. So some number that is above 0.81. So let's say like 0.9. No, that's pretty close, like 0.85. This is going to make it so that the linear fall off is only happening here, and we kind of have a bit more buffer room. So I'm actually just going to bring this down to like maybe that's a bit much. Maybe I could bring this down. You just keep messing with these until you get something that looks a bit nicer, and we're going to need more geometry. And at this point, since we keep adding more subdivisions, probably makes sense. Hey, you like that? Probably makes sense to go experimental, because now we can do adaptive subdivisions, in other words, divisions on the fly, and now we can see that it's actually looking pretty good. It didn't look like it without it, because again, we needed more divisions. But with it, it's looking pretty good. You can see there's a bit of a slope, which ideally does exist, so it's not going straight up. I can make that a bit more intense, and now we have a crust that we can control. So that's pretty cool. I'm thinking that, is this slice a bit too thick? I guess we can always go back and change it later. But I do think this is a good base for what we're doing. So I'm just going to bring our divisions down a bit. Just so it's looking a bit cleaner. And now the next step is making our, and this is another new part. This is probably something you didn't know since I didn't explain it yet. Now the question is, how do we take this ridge and kind of add those ruffles? And let me actually import in some reference. And yeah, that's right, we're using reference. And by the way, the original version I made did have this cross-hatching, but I decided it'd be a bit too complicated. I might come back to it, but basically it's just like, you multiply a bunch of sine waves on the x and y axis, but whatever. You can see that the crust kind of has these ruffles. And how do we do that? Because that's kind of like a radial angular effect, and we haven't talked about how to do that. So let's actually do exactly that. We're going to take all this, group it, Control G. So again, now we have another vector displacement step. This one's going to be our crust, because, you know, we raise the crust. Oh yeah, raise the roof. This is exciting. But again, what we have is our initial coordinates that were then transformed into a triangle, that were then rounded, that were then turned into this crust. And now the next thing again is doing this radial effect, okay? And to explain this, I guess let me actually add in another object, which is kind of a new thing for this. This is not very Nodevember-y, but we will get rid of it. The question is, how do we make a radial effect where we're not talking about X and Y, but we're talking about like the angle around the plane? And I'll explain that in a second. To do that, what we're going to do is use a coordinate system like, I don't know, you could use generated, object, whatever. Point is we need to separate by X, Y, Z, and instead of using something called rectangular coordinates, which is this idea of going left to right on X, up and down, we want to transform this into polar coordinates, so the radius and the angle, right? So instead of X and Y, you substituted for polar coordinates. To do that math, and I'm not going to like, I'm not your math teacher. Okay, I'm not going to explain this all the way through. But the function that takes some X, Y, rectangular coordinates and gives us angles is, it's arctangent, but you need to divide Y over X. So basically what it is, ideally, I think it's arctangent, not arctan2, but arctangent, where what you input is a division of Y, Y over X. You take this, you input it, and it should give us something kind of angular. So you see we have 0, and it scrolls up, and then some of it's negative, which is why it's looking weird, but that's the function for that. What arctan2 does, it's kind of a shortcut, is it already has the division packed in. So this already has the Y over X, and it does a bit of a transformation for us. So right now it's going from 0 up to pi, I believe, and then it's kind of, okay, let me explain that again. The angle is going from 0, and then it's revolving all the way until pi, because again, this is radians, not degrees, and then in this way, we go 0 to negative pi, right? And we could solve this, or we can kind of remap this, so it's looking much nicer, either with map arrange, which is something I don't normally do, but let's see if it works. So instead of going from 0 to 1, let's go from negative pi to pi. So now you can see we're getting this 0 to 1. This gives us a nice radial effect, again, because we've exchanged a rectangular for polar coordinates. And now the question is, how do we add in kind of like more sets of this so we can control the number of ridges and all this? Again, polar coordinates, look it up if you don't know. What we can do to do this is, instead of going from 0 to 1, is we could go to 0 to 3. So now it's going from 0 all the way to 3, meaning we kind of have this kind of repeating thing in some sense. If we were to add in a fraction, or maybe modulo 1, they should do the same thing. Now you can see, since we are going from 0 to 3, if we use fraction every time we go past an integer like 1.1, that gets rounded down to 0.1, etc. So we have 3 intervals, or we could have 4 intervals, or 5, and this is kind of like a key trick in polar coordinates. And I think this should be the same as mod 1, but you could also do like fraction mods to get multipliers and all that. Point is, what we want to do is add in a value slider, because this is going to be a very important quantity to control, the number of this. And then I don't think we're too concerned about the rest of this. We can just copy this, delete the plane, and head back over to our pi. Okay? So how does this connect with what we were doing before? It's basically the exact same setup, but for our initial coordinates, we're not going to use the generated coordinates of the plane. We're going to use our vector displaced modified generated coordinates right here. Which when we view, you can see it's centered here, and you can kind of see those saw blade effects from before. This is kind of like the ceiling fan effect is a good way to think about it. You do it on a hot summer's day, although it's November. So we can take this, increase these slices, and you kind of want to think about these as if they are cutting the crust. So we kind of need a big number. So now we have 1, 2, 3, 4 ridges. We could even go higher than this, but for now this should be fine. We want to take this and basically say, incorporate this into our vector displacement. Okay? So what we can do is we can use some vector math, again, using the last used vector from before in our chain. We are going to take this, and I think what we want to do is scale this away from the origin. You could also think about it as an addition. However, maybe multiplication is the way to go. So we are going to scale this away from the origin. And we're not just going to use this like radial map as is, because if we did that, let's actually see what we get. Combine x, y, z. We want to scale this on the x and on the y, and for z we want to keep it the same, so just put in 1. When we do it like this, we are going to get some seriously messed up results. You can see we kind of took our pi and turned it, we turned it into like, this is that Harry Potter book that you haven't read for ages and all the corners are bent and stuff like that. Probably Philosopher's Stone, because he was actually reading that one. you can see this isn't exactly what we want. And first of all, it's because we need to mask off the area of the crust. And we should have a mask for that from here. Is it this one? Yeah. So we can actually make an output for this, so we can reuse it. So again, we can use a mask from a previous node again, because the generated coordinates kind of take it along for the ride is the idea here. We want to do this so that, let's think about this. This is kind of like the inverted mask from what we want. So maybe what we could do is add another math range. And this one we're going to kind of do the opposite. Actually, you know what? What am I talking about? Forget what I'm talking about. This is actually exactly what we want, because white is where we need to multiply, etc. What was I saying? We want to take this and multiply it by our factor. So let's actually move everything down, or else Blender is going to mess everything up when we add an extra node. It's a nice feature, but it also pisses me the fuck off. We're going to take this. We are going to multiply it by what? Because right now we have this. We want to multiply it by our factor. Okay, so now it's still not going to look correct. However, this time when we plug stuff in, it is looking slightly better. I mean, I guess it's not looking too hot, but whatever. It exists. One thing we can do to make this look better is, instead of having this 0 to 1 thing, is we kind of want to shape this. Oh, that I always talk about this thing that sprays scent in my room. It always scares me. Rgb Curves is the way to do this. We don't talk about this much. But this is a visual way to take a interval and send it to another, kind of like map range, but with much more control. So now when we view this, we're taking 0 to 1 and mapping it to 0 to 0, and I'm just going to take the center and bring it up. So now we should have like black going to white to black to white to black. So here's what we had before and after. And the nice thing about this is we could kind of add a arbitrary amount of detail, so you can kind of have a weird crust shape. So the way you want to think about this is every crust segment is going to have this design when we project it outwards. So that's just something to consider. Let's clamp this and send it over here. And this should give us the right thing, or something close to it. I am seeing that it's looking a bit messed up. Let's fix that. And when you think about it really hard, like you're really kind of squeezing your brain, all the juices going on the floor, you're slipping on it, everything is going crazy. The reason that this is an issue, and actually let me go back so we can visualize this a bit better, is our map, after it's being multiplied in Rgb curves and all that, basically, since we are scaling this, it's saying take the centerpiece and scale it down to 0, because again, we're inputting 0, whereas what we want is kind of the identity. In other words, what I'm trying to say is it shouldn't be like 0 and everything else is, you know, a different number. It should be 1, so it's preserved and everything else is different, right? And, you know, that's actually a pretty easy fix. You take this, you add, now with clamp, you add 1, okay? And this should make it look somewhat more correct. We should still have a couple issues, but that is looking much better. Wow. That's just like when you go to the barber shop and they give you that fresh cut. Okay, so that's looking pretty okay. Another thing to consider is this should, again, only be moving the crust. And I think the issue is, I think we use the, let's see what map we used. Yeah, we used this one. That doesn't isolate the area where the crust is, etc. So what we want to do is isolate for that. Do we actually have a map for that? I don't think we do. We might need to make one ourselves. In other words, again, what I'm saying here is that we have this map. Let's see, before we add one, this is where we're going to do our multiplication, but we don't want the bottom of the pie to have this, okay? So easy enough. What we need to do is, again, separate x, y, z, which we already have. We take the z component, and this time, I guess this would be an okay situation to use greater than, but since I've been vouching like a lunatic, like a fanatic really, for map range, let's use map range. Okay, so this time, instead of going from 0 to 1, let's start from like higher up, just like that. Let's actually isolate it a bit better. So it should be like 0.1 or something, 0.12. We can always come back and fix this later. You just want to make sure it's going above the kind of base of this. Maybe 0.15. I guess we could use some math from before to figure it out. But what we want to do is take our mask and multiply it by this again, because we are isolating that area. So we take this, we multiply by this factor, don't need a clamp, and now, there we go. Now what we have, again, just to kind of go over what we did here, we have our radial kind of thing, which we then multiplied by the area where this is the crust, and then again by the top area and did some Rgb curves. What this is giving us, at the end of the day, is it's giving us a displacement, but only in this area away from the origin. So it's going to multiply it by this factor. And what I was trying to say is the nice thing about this setup is you can imagine each of these ridges is basically a instance, a copy, a member of, there's probably more ways to describe that, of this Rgb curves. So if I make this shape, you can see it's actually being reflected here, and you can draw a custom, kind of like, wow, I'm so gassy, a custom kind of like pie crust. So maybe you want to make it look kind of like messed up and very detailed. And another thing you can do again, since we have this value node, is we can control the number of instances. Each one is going to have this in there. Okay, so let's actually take this value node. We want to keep it for later. And then otherwise, maybe we should add in a multiplication just before the addition. And this is going to control kind of the intensity of this effect. And we can make that another slider just so we can access it later. Boop. And now let's get rid of this stuff. So let's take this messy node group and say, you know what? Is it a mess? Yes. Am I going to fix it? No. Okay, so I'm going to shift right click. Wow, that's a hard shift right click right there. Just like that. Just isolate it. And we're going to create a node group. So drag everything, Control G, and hopefully that got the whole thing. Okay. And what we need to do, of course, since I guess I didn't do it, is if we want this node group to be able to control these parameters, you have to add in controls for that. So that one should be 20. And what's this one control? This one controls the scale. So let's control that as well. Okay, so now you can see this has two numbers. So this one should be 20, I believe, for the number of ridges. And the second one is going to be the size of our effect. And we can give a name to that, but I kind of don't want to. So we have our crust. We now have Crust Distortion. It's probably a good name for that. And you know what? I'm being lazy. I'm being really lazy. Let's actually give this a name. Number as in number of ridges, and value as in as what? Kind of like ridge scale or something. Boom. So now these have nice names and everything. Okay, cool. So what is the next step in the process? Well, the next step is, if you notice, in this slice, and maybe it's more obvious, and believe me, I prepared for this tutorial. I've recorded it so many times. This one's actually kind of a frustrating tutorial to make because, I don't know, it just took me so many takes. But you can see that we kind of have the same setup where we have the thing and there's crust and it's manipulated, but you can see that there's a bit of a slant because the pie, as the whole thing isn't very circular, it's kind of like circular, but then it extends kind of like a cylinder growing. And we can include that actually very, very simply. What we need to do that is, again, separate XYZ, since we want to scale based on the height. So as we go further up, it's going to be translated more to the left. And then you could do this either as a multiplication or addition. In this case, it probably makes sense to do this as an addition. Use the last step in your vector math. Take this, connect it, and for the addition, we are going to separate by component so that we only, want to add going to the left, in other words, on the y-axis based on the z-axis. So again, as we go up here, it should be going more to the left. So let's connect that right there. Okay, we take this, we view it, and let's see what that looks like. Boom, now we have our shearing. Now we're partying, right? To control the effect here, just like every other time, what we're going to do is kind of control this z before it even reaches this combine XYZ. And we can do that with some map range. Boom, connect that. And I guess a good way to figure out exactly what numbers we need is we just kind of increase this until we have the entire thing. So the entire thing slanted, and then instead of going from 0 to 1, we could go to like 0 to 0.5 or something, and that's going to be half the scale. When it's 0, it's going to have none, etc. And maybe this should be a slider as well. Okay, so let's add in a value node, connect that here. So again, this is going to be our shearing, and I think that should be good to go. So let's add another node group. So you can see, again, I'm trying to demonstrate good workflow. I don't want you guys going out there into the workforce ill-prepared. High school didn't prepare you for this, right? I want you to kind of keep stuff organized in a way that makes sense. So this is going to be our shearing, our slanting, our taking the fur off the sheep. Cotton? What is it that sheep have? They definitely have something that we like. But you can see, what was I talking about? How did I go from that to like such a normal transition? You can see, again, we are taking our vector displacement and going step by step by step. I've kind of made a mess of it, but at least it's in node groups. And we have a lot of factors exposed, etc. And notice that every factor we've made from before, which this is the crust one, has come along for the ride, which is very useful. And we're actually going to use that later on. So I'm thinking there's really only one or two more things we want to add. One of them is definitely some distortion, because right now it's kind of looking too clean. And then the second one is all the berries in the middle. And that should be very simple. And the berries in the middle is what I'm excited to talk about. But first of all, let's add in a bit of noise. And this is where we have a good tip coming in from Gabe right out of high school. I don't know how old Gabe is. I feel like he's very young. He's the kind of kid who's going to be making like $1 million, $2 million at like an entry, not an entry level. I'm saying his first job coming right into the workforce, they're going to hire him as like a VFX supervisor or something, shader specialist. He is so talented. But a tip from Gabe coming in hot is normally when we have taken vector coordinates and messed with noise just to kind of include them and to add a bit of distortion, what we usually did is we kind of did a vector math setup where we kind of scaled both and were able to control this. And again, I mean, okay, let me actually explain what I'm talking about. It's probably the easiest way. If I take this and add noise, you can see, okay, it's making it noisy. It looks like garbage, but not only that. You notice that when I did this, it actually shifted everything up, and that's because on average, noise is 0 to 1 on every component XYZ, which means on average, we're adding the vector 0.5, 0.5, 0.5 when you take all those points and, you know, average them out. And the way we usually solve this is we did this, and then we subtracted the 0.5, 0.5, 0.5 vector, meaning that now we can kind of control this procedurally and it stays in place, right? That is the approach we normally went for. But Gabe, in his infinite wisdom, told me that there's actually a very useful way to do this very quickly, and that's using Mix RGB. Note that Mix RGB and vector math are essentially the same thing. Color and vector data is, I mean, I don't know if it's literally the same, but it's kind of like taking your left testicle and distinguishing it from your right. Technically, they're different. They're in different places, right? But they both serve the same function. You wouldn't want to lose either. So in other words, what we can do is we can take both of these. So you can think of this as our vector math. And the difference here, and you're thinking, okay, what's the point? The difference here is we have an operation called linear light, which automatically does that, like adding, or I guess subtracting that 0.5, 0.5, 0.5 vector, depending on the scale. In other words, we've compressed all that process from before, which would have taken like 4 or 5 nodes to get full control over. We've taken and brought it down to 1 node, right? And we can have this nice slider that exactly controls the distortion. By the way, this is using generated coordinates, which are coming along for the ride, but we did transform those, so let's actually connect that in here. So that will give us a nicer noise that's kind of uniform. But again, we now have a single slider that controls all this stuff, and this isn't like the noise quality, right? We can control that here, but just how we want to blend those together. So let's make our noise like less or like a lower frequency and maybe slightly higher detail so that there's a bit more going on. And this is kind of hard to see maybe because of YouTube compression. But you can see here was flat. It's bendy, but it's flat, the surface. But when we add detail, you can see that there's some bumpiness, right? So I'm just going to add in a bit of detail and maybe a bit of roughness. Not too much because it's going to make it very, you guessed it, rough. But this is just to give a form to our pie slice. So let's actually decrease divisions. So you can see this is before, kind of boring, and then after. So this just this tiny modification adds quite a bit. And we could add distortion and stuff like that. I'm feeling like maybe a tiny bit's a good idea. So let's try like 0.1 and keep increasing 0.5. Yeah, I think that's better with versus without. Let's see if we go even higher. This is kind of like the creative control segment. Do whatever you want. We'll keep it at 1. You can see this adds quite a bit of detail. And again, no matter what we do, and this is a key concept for what we're about to do, no matter what we do, it retains the mask. Because again, everything starts off with our modified generated coordinates, okay? Okay, so now this is kind of like the next step, and by kind of I mean it is the next step in our node group. I think this one I'm not going to make, or I guess the next step in our vector displacement. I guess this one I'm not going to make a node group since it's really only 2 nodes. I mean, when has that stopped me before? But whatever. Drinking some water. Get all those ASMR sounds. Because it's very few nodes, I'm just going to keep it exposed. Next step and kind of final step in the displacement sense. How much time do we have left? because we are getting close to the end. Ooh, 2 minutes. That's a yikes. I don't know if we can do this in 2 minutes. Rip Nodevember. Whatever. I guess I technically made the result before the end of the day. And I guess there's also upload time and all that. The next step, well, what were we talking about, is adding in berries now that we've done our noise. And by the way, you don't only have to add in a single noise here, you can actually add in a bunch of them. So actually, let me do that. I'm going to add in another linear light to our chain. And for this one, let's use not a noise texture, but a wave texture. Yes, whoops, not wavelength, wave texture. Yes, every one of these little orange boys is going to add in quite a bit of computation time because these are pretty heavy in terms of how expensive they are as operations. But they do add so much good detail that I'd feel bad about losing it, right? And let's actually bring this down if we are going to add in even more distortion, okay? So wave texture, again, I'm using the new coordinates. Let's actually see what these look like on our updated coordinates. You can imagine these are kind of like stripes cutting through this. I'm just going to play with this. I'm no pastry baker. I don't know what's technically correct. I'm thinking that this is like okay, especially when we add a bit of distortion and stuff. Just so it looks like maybe there was some dough that was like made in like one direction, kind of like the grain of it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to connect this right here. And again, this is controlled by the linear light. Otherwise, it would be moving off kind of like to infinity. So you can see here it's going to be translated just a bit. Here we go. When it updates, should be off somewhere. No idea where it is. But because of linear light, when we do this, everything's going to be fine. And this time we need to make it very small. So like 0.02, something like that. Even that's looking pretty extreme. So let's try like 0.01. Just so there are kind of like very vague lines that exist. Probably helps to see the BSDF. Yeah, that is still quite intense. We could add in a bit of detail and stuff just to roughen it up a bit so they're not these like perfectly straight lines. So detail with a bit of detail roughness should help. So maximum detail, maybe detail scale can help. I don't mess with this one that much, if you couldn't already tell. But last time I made this node for myself, or I guess this whole graph, I actually ended up making this quite a small number. So what we can do is just keep dividing by 2 until we are happy with the result. Did that not update? Is there like a limit to how small you can make it? So 0.01 divide by 2. Okay, so that's even smaller. Divide by 2. Okay, that's even smaller. And now we're getting pretty close to what I want. In fact, I think I want even more ridges. So let's up this to 10. And yeah, there we go. Now it's looking very nice. And I think finally one more division by 2 should do it. And this just is kind of a very small effect, but you can see this is going to add quite a bit of realism in the final result. Okay, cool. So this is our noise step. And maybe I should, yeah, whatever. I'll keep it exposed. I'm not going to make it a node group. Now comes the super interesting part. It's interesting because of how easy it is of adding in our berries. Again, the berries should kind of be, let's see our reference. Actually, let me see the original reference, the render I made. So in the version I made, it's going to be kind of like spilling out as if you kind of made a grilled cheese sandwich. And although instead of grilled cheese, it's it's just gross, right? It's going to be going along here. So somehow we need to have a mask that kind of defines this area. But not only that, it moves with our distortion, which again, that's why I keep talking about generated coordinates. It's a big deal. But what I'm trying to say is if we go deeper, backwards, if we go further back into our network when this was simpler, something like this, I think at this point would be a good time to isolate that area, okay? So we could kind of take any part of this node graph and make the mask from there. So for this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make our separate XYZ. So now we have our Z component. To isolate the middle, there's probably a couple ways to do it. Map range is definitely one. Should I use map range? Let me try something a bit fancier. If it doesn't work, we'll use map range. We're going to set this to absolute value, so it's kind of mirrored along the z-axis. So from 0 to positive, it's going white, and then negative, it's getting absolute valued. So again, it's kind of mirrored along here. We take this, and then I think we subtract away a value. It's either this or the exact opposite. Lets us, there we go, kind of control a mask with the amount of fall off and all that, okay? And this is basically saying take this and subtract away our absolute value. In other words, kind of compute the distance between these. We're going to clamp it so that the black is actually set to 0. We want this, which kind of defines our slice, but again, only before the crust. So we also need a radial thing that we've been doing a bunch of times. For this one, we are just going to connect this. As always, we're going to set this to length, view it, and I'm thinking for this one, I think there is an argument to be made for maybe a cutoff instead of a map range. I think this will be the first cutoff in this tutorial. And by that, I just mean like a greater than, less than node, right? This kind of has a harsh edge instead of a map range node. I guess it's always best to do it the other way, but we can always go back and change this. So you take this idea and multiply it by this idea. Now we've isolated this triangle. And again, what's the big deal about this? The big deal is now when we update our vector displacement, by the way, I'm not full screen. When we update our vector displacement, you can see it's the same slice, but now the noise and all that has been applied, which is pretty cool. Maybe one thing to do before we reach this multiplication is let's add in another multiplication. Wow, I'm struggling to talk. This one's for the subtraction slider, so kind of like this Z mask we made. And we want to kind of make that a bit brighter, just so it's actually being closer to 1 in some sense, or I guess in every sense. Okay, so now we have this mask, and we can set it up as a group later once we are ready, but to actually make our berries, so we have the mask saying where we want them, but of course that doesn't answer the question, how do we make our berries? To do that, I bet there's probably an easier way. Actually, there probably isn't. The easiest way to do it is with a Voronoi texture, which again, if you don't remember, what it does is it scatters a bunch of points and kind of looks at which areas are, or I guess which fragments are closest to each. So let's actually update our coordinate system. You can see this already has dots, which you can think of as our berries, but you can see it separates everything into fragments, which is going to be very convenient for what we're doing. Okay, so we're going to take this same idea as before. We're going to use a subtraction distance, which is going to give us this. If we take the reciprocal, now we have these nice blobs. We can have more of them just by increasing the scale. Let's have it like this. And you can already imagine how this is kind of looking like berries. And we want to take this and say, you know what, Blender, you dumb idiot, you big galoof. You want to take this and multiply it by our mask. So now we have the berry mask only here. And we're probably going to need to play with this a bit more, but to add this into our displacement, we're going to use a node that, quite frankly, we forgot about. We've been using vector math, the addition, the multiplication, the scaling, but do you remember the displacement node? You remember that thing back when we weren't dealing with vector displacement? By the way, whoops, not by the way, now that we are using the displacement node, and now that you've kind of done all this vector displacement stuff, I think it's time for you guys to learn kind of like the big boy version of what this is. The displacement node really is pretty much kind of like a scaling or a multiplication from the vector math, but along the normal. So in other words, we are just going to be adding displacement that is not going in an arbitrary direction, like upwards to left, but along the surface normals, okay? So displacement could actually be done if we had our, and I went on a rant about this, if we have our normal coordinates, it's essentially the same thing as doing this and scaling it by some height map, where this is this height, or the scale is pretty much the same thing as this height, okay? Basically the same thing, just in a nicer setup. But we can take this, say we want these dots to be our height. I don't really, to be honest, I don't really understand how normals, it seems like they are computed in some sense. Maybe it's because those generated coordinates are brought along for the ride, or maybe it's because the origin's right here. So the normal's kind of in a convenient place if you remember the original cube. Well, whatever the reason, when you do this, this should work. So again, we now have this map that it generates, okay, based off of our Voronoi. Let's actually clamp that. So we have this, and what we want to do is just like any other vector math, like how do we take vector displacement and combine normal displacement? Because again, this is just a normal vector scaled. What we could do is just vector math, just like any other step in this like node tree over here. We take this and we just add the last thing that we've used, which again is this one. We take it, we add our displacement, and now when we do this, you're gonna see, boom, everything breaks, okay? You're probably thinking, wow, very useful. I'm glad I stuck around for this tutorial to learn this. It should be working. I think the thing is the mid-level is set too high, so right now we're kind of adding an additional vector that we don't want. And you see when we get rid of that, it kind of solves the issue. We do have a bit of a normal issue, by the way. over here, because again, we took that face from way before back in the triangle step and compressed it, which means the normals are changing very rapidly, but whatever. You can see that we now have these blobs sticking out along the direction of the normal, and it seems correct. You take the scale, and bring it down, and it's looking even better, and it almost solves the normal issue in a way that's presentable. Okay? To make this kind of look a bit nicer, we can kind of control the fall off. So again, this is the subtraction is controlling the blobs if we visualize it. It's controlling the blobs, but what we can do is add in, before we even get to this multiplication, which again is clamping it to this mask, what we can do is we can take a power function, and I think taking a square root is what we want. I'm not sure. I guess we can actually check a couple of these. So when it's to the power of 1, nothing's going to happen. 0.5 should be smoother, and then like going in an exponent higher than 1 is going to give us very sharp stuff. So we want to go somewhere between 0 and 1. And I'm thinking that something like the square root curve, so the power 0.5, should give us what we want. That's looking pretty good. Again, the more geometry we add, the better this is going to look. But you can kind of see this is kind of like a pie slice with stuff flowing out of it. And the best part, again, is we now have a mask to describe exactly where that is. Long story short, we've kind of done all the vector displacement. Yes, you could go back and add more or maybe like modify stuff like this. But I'm going to Shift P this to put it in a frame. And now, for the rest of the story, let's actually do some principled BSDF magic. So we're done with displacement, and now let's talk about the surface stuff, which is actually pretty simple. Now, technically, there are 2 ways to do this. I'm going to show you the kind of quick and easy way. This isn't how I rendered it, by the way, what I'm about to show you, but it does look very realistic very quickly. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add in 2 BSDFs. So we're going to have one for the pie crust and one for the stuff in the middle. We're going to mix these together. Let's have one be red, just so we know which is which. And again, we now have this Voronoi kind of cutoff area that we can use as a factor. So just connect this here, and boom. You can kind of see it's doing the right thing. The reason this isn't working perfectly is because this mask is kind of, it's not like a 0 or 1 mask, right? It's not saying this is where it is or this is where it isn't. It's a 0 to 1 mask, which kind of has a lot of fall off and stuff like that, which is going to make this look very soft. Not an issue. You don't want to look soft in front of the boys. Here's the solution. Add in a math node, set it to either multiply and multiplied by like a big number. That's one solution, or another. And this is kind of a very different result, is you could take to the power of like a very small number near 0. And you can see these kind of give you different effects because they can kind of interact with the fall off differently. I'm just going to use multiply because it's easy to understand, okay? So now we've kind of isolated these areas. And again, I know I keep saying it, dear God, but everything we do is procedural. We can always go back and add more distortion. And I'm thinking this pie crust could use a bit more kind of breaking up. So I'm just going to increase this to like 0.15 or something. So now you can see this is looking much more damaged, and we can bring down the scale. So it's like lower frequency detail. And you can always go back and change that. But now to make this look realistic, for this material, we're going to use like a red, something like that. The key to making it look like it's fruit is, first of all, it's kind of very reflective, right? So roughness should be set at 0, so there's actually reflections going on. And the second thing is transmission. You want to bring that all the way up as if it's made of jelly or something like that. You can also go like halfway in between. This isn't very physically accurate, but it does kind of give you this kind of almost jelly-like quality. I know it might not be exactly what you want, but it's a quick way to get the result, and we'll make it look a bit better in a second. To control the color in a way that isn't just saying, you know what, base color, let's kind of use the simp method. Simp as in simple, not as in, you know, how simp is used nowadays. Instead of doing this, what we could do is have the same color, but have a bit of variation. How do we get that variation based on like which berry almost we're looking at? It's a good question. I'll explain it in a second once I find multiply. So we're going to take this and multiply it by the color black with a mixing factor that's not going to be set to 0 or 1. What we're going to use for the mixing factor, again, we have this convenient Voronoi that exactly describes like fragments and gives us a random number for each. What we can do is actually use this. I'm just going to drag it up so it's a bit closer and we can see. again, what am I trying to say? We have this manipulated version that gives us the berries and stuff like that. The Voronoi not only gives us this information, but for each one of these berries, it actually generates a random number, or really a random vector. So if we take this and multiply it, or use it as the factor for the multiplication, let's bring this back down. You're going to see, when we actually view this, then now we get the same setup, but now some berries are brighter and darker than others, which is kind of the same thing we have going on here. Again, the reason this works is because the Voronoi is giving us a different number to multiply this color by black. So some are going to be multiplied by a large number and be very dark, and others won't, etc. On top of this, we could also add in a bit of clear coat, so it's super shiny, maybe up the transmission a bit. And you could do some ambient occlusion stuff, but that should be a good start. Speaking of ambient occlusion, the quick way to do the pie crust and make it look really realistic without, using your masks to make the crust slightly more burnt and stuff like that, a quick way to do this is with the ambient occlusion node. Something to note is if you are using, and let's view this, if you are using optics, currently, I don't know when you're like watching this tutorial, but if you're a true fan, you watch the anime all the way through. Let me drink water. Oh, I'm choking, boys. Let's try that again. There we go. If you're a true anime fan and have like stayed with us throughout the entire arc, the crazy default cube arc, and back when CG Matter was formal tutorials, I don't know what the point was. I've literally no idea what I was building up to. What I was trying to say is the ambient occlusion node doesn't work with optics. It does work with CUDA. I have no idea what rant I was going on there. I think I'm going crazy. First of all, you want to switch to CUDA, and this is going to let you add in an ambient occlusion node, which again is going to output a ambient occlusion map calculated with cycles. So it's a real calculation. You can control the number of samples and all that. Using this, we can very quickly create a pie crust. Again, if you're using optics, which a lot of people are, this is not going to work. What we're going to do is we are going to take this and filter it just so it's a bit of a harsher map. So I think we want a large exponent. So now you can kind of see all those ridges and details and stuff like that. And the idea here is we're going to use this as the basis for a color ramp, which we're going to use for the base color. Oh, I'm sorry, that water, as you would say, went down the wrong pipe, okay? What were we talking about? What we can do is take this, send it through a color ramp, and connect this into the base color. So this is what is going to be viewed for that section before it reaches the mix shader. So you can see, once that updates, we have the jelly and just kind of this very harsh looking thing. Of course, we don't want it to look like that. What we want to do is pick some very pie-like colors. I don't know what that means. I'm thinking for the white, in other words, where this is very exposed, I'm going to pick kind of like a golden one. So you could either put in the colors manually, or if you hit E, when you're over this, you hit E. That's E for eyedropper. You can just select some colors from a reference image. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to have some yellows, and then back here, we're going to have some whites. Boom. And then to make this look good, you're just going to move around all the stuff near the top, because I guess most of this is actually close to white. You just move this just like that, and you can see this already gives us some very quick color variation. And you could up the kind of contrast of this map. So you can, this actually kind of very welly, I don't know. It defines the ridges using color, although the issue is if you add in another object, like this one, I think ambient occlusion, maybe it's not. I was going to say that ambient occlusion uses this intersecting object as part of the calculation, but maybe it doesn't. Maybe that also needs ambient occlusion. Or maybe it's this only local slider. Point is, this gives us most of what we need. Something just to make it look a bit better. Like, I think kind of the main thing is we want the crust to be a bit darker. We could use a similar trick from before with this multiply. So let's actually just multiply this. And then for the factor of where it should be darker, way back from the beginning, and maybe you don't remember, but this is me. This is my genius. This is like the plan I set up 10 movies ago just to execute and show my evil plan. You can see a while ago we created this mask exactly describing, where we want this crust to be darker. Okay, so we take this, we connect this as our factor, and let's actually just bring that back down. Oh, I'm such a genius. Got to pat myself on the back for this one. This is basically going to define which areas are going to be darker. And it probably makes sense to, I mean, I was going on my spiel about all this genius, etc. To be honest, this mask ain't all that. Maybe it's worth using this radial map and just doing a bit of modification for that. So let's actually do it this way. Point is, we can use masks from before again, just like we used it for these berries. We can use maps from before to define where we want this crust to be darker, okay? So for this, I'm just going to up it just like this. So whatever's left over is going to be slightly darker, and we can play around with the gradient and stuff like that. But before we do that, let's just connect this as our factor and view it like this. And now that we have this map range, we can actually just like pull which areas should and should not be darker. So you can see we're going deeper and deeper into here. I guess way too deep. Just like that. And we can also control the fall off. Whoa, that is intense. Let's make that less intense. Okay, there you go. So you can see what we've done is we've basically created a nice map that's getting darker as it goes outwards, or I guess it's getting brighter, which in this sense it's getting darker. So you can see it's getting darker over here. And then long story short, it gives a kind of extra detail that really does look good. Last kind of tip I would recommend is just adding in a bit of bump detail, so kind of like fake displacement, just because it's like essentially free. It just needs you to add another noise texture. But other than that, it doesn't really cost you anything. So I'm thinking, I guess it could be anything. I don't mess around with Voronoi that much to know exactly what we need, but I'm just going to use the very last output as our texture system. So again, this is our updated coordinates, so it should be mapped on correctly once it loads. I guess, did we pull the latest thing? I guess we did. I guess there is a bit of distortion, but I guess calm down. Because most of the distortion happens where the berries are, that's not a big deal. Because again, this is the material for the crust. Okay, it doesn't matter what happens in the berries. What you want to do? Oh, that scared me. What you want to do is take this, pick a very big number, just so you have a lot of detail, and set this to some kind of crackly thing, like distance to edge. So this is just going to be like the crust breaking a bit. We're going to take this. We're going to throw it through a bump node, which kind of works like a displacement node. You just say this is the height, and it's going to give you normal information for free. Plug this into the normal, and let's view this over here. And it's probably, once it loads, it's going to be way too intense. So first of all, you want to make it way smaller, so something like 40. And second of all, the strength should not be that strong. And this is just going to give you that tiny bit of detail that when you zoom in, you're like, oh, indeed the surface is breaking a bit. Okay, last thing to make this pie crust look very good instantly, but also it's going to crash your computer. Subsurface scattering, I don't know if it's physically accurate for this, but dear God, it makes food look sexy as fuck. You just want to ram your tongue into that food because you know you're going to eat it, right? Subsurface scattering is that effect where light goes through meshes, kind of like a flashlight through your fingers. I'm going to pick a small number for this, and I'm going to pick a color that's very kind of warm, like red or orange. And you're going to see very instantly it's going to give our like crust this very soft, almost spongy looking thing, which makes stuff look very appetizing. We could even like darken this a bit so that most of the lighting is coming from, yep, that is too much. So that most of the lighting is coming from that subsurface. So we could just bump this up to 0.2 or something. But yeah. Subsurface scattering really is the trick here, along with ambient occlusion. In my render, I didn't use ambient occlusion again because of the optics thing, although subsurface renders very quickly. So instead, I made a custom map without ambient occlusion and all that. But there you go. Now we should have a setup that, and here's kind of like the big reveal, my favorite part. I always like to add in a scale at the very end. When you set this to 0, it's our cube with all the generated coordinate stuff that, again, went along for the ride. So you're like, oh, how did you know exactly where to place everything? You didn't. You just kind of went backwards in time with hindsight. But this is the transformation, which is super cool. I guess one final adjustment we never corrected for that addition we did like ages ago. So we can just do that as the last step. No harm done. We just move this along the Y in the negative direction. And I guess another thing we could do, or you know what? I was going to say another thing we could do is make it a bit bigger, but I think, to be honest, this kind of is an okay size for a pie slice. But look at that. I mean, it's definitely looking like pie. You can change around stuff. Again, originally I added those cross-hatching weaving patterns on the top, and it looked really good, but I decided to, get rid of that because then you'd have to worry about the berries on top. It just makes stuff confusing. But there you go. That is the tutorial. Dear God, how long did we go? We went up to 23, so I think this is like a 40 or 50-minute tutorial, but this is a good one. Anyways, if you enjoyed this kind of like phone sex operator tutorial, I hope it wasn't too annoying. Patreon is the place to get all that extra stuff that you just don't get on YouTube, okay? So the blend file for the original one that has much more control. By the way, just one tiny thing, just one tiny detail that maybe you don't remember from very long ago, but I just want to bring it up. It's one of these groups. I think it should be the triangle group. Yeah, this one. Remember that we have control over everything, so we can always change the size of this thing, and it always works with our mask and everything like that. So that's how I changed the size of the pie slice and stuff like that, along with other things, but whatever. What was I talking about? Patreon exists. You can get the original blend file with all the sliders, so you can play around with it, and along with following this tutorial. There's also exclusive content, tutorials that I do not post here or on the CG Matter channel, although I've been kind of tuning those out a little bit for this month because I'm making like a long-ass tutorial every day of the month. But I'm going to try to get some up maybe this week. But those exist. You get the blend files, you get Discord access, you get behind the scenes. What else do you get? You get my love and affection. You have that anyways. But yeah, Patreon is the best way to support both of these YouTube channels. I'm hoping that you are liking these tutorials because I'm enjoying making them. And yeah, thank you to all, however many patrons. Thank you if you are considering or not, whatever, just watching this tutorial at this point, like all the way to completion. Pretty cool. Yeah, that's all I have to say. You now know how to turn a cube. This is the most useless fucking tutorial ever. You now know how to turn a cube. Let's do that reveal into pie. And with that, I bid you farewell. Thank you for watching, and see ya.